Good evening. My name is Will Greene, and I'm the guest speaker this evening at the Milwaukee Civil War Roundtable here at the Wisconsin Club. My topic is going to be the first Petersburg offensive from the crossing of the James through June 18, 1864, which is a part of my latest book called A Campaign of Giants, The Battle for Petersburg. This is the first volume of 3 projected volumes published by the University of North Carolina Press. It's available in print from UNC Press or Barnes & Noble or Amazon or anywhere where good books are sold. I appreciate it. Thank you. Frank, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I am sincerely honored by the plaques that you have given me tonight. It means a lot to me. I'm getting up there in age here now, and you start to think about your career and who your audiences have been. And, I chose to be what we call a public historian as opposed to an academic historian. In other words, I've worked in parks and historic sites and battlefield preservation as opposed to teaching in college after graduate school, because, frankly, it's people like you that I want to interact with and hope I can impart some knowledge. And the fact that you all gave me these awards is justification for the work that I've done, and it means a lot to me. So thank you very much. That's a real pleasure to be back here in Milwaukee. I'm delighted that you all are meeting in person. We haven't done very many talks or tours in the last year. I've given 2 talks, I think, since COVID started, both in the state of Wisconsin, here and in Kenosha, of all places. But we're back on the hustings. Speaking of tours, I'm going to finally get back to leading a tour in September. We're going to be following Ulysses S. Grant from Cairo to Corinth. If anybody's interested in taking that tour, it's going to be from September 6th through 11th through America's History LLC. I'd be happy to give you some information on that if you're interested in checking that out. But tonight we're going to be talking about Grant and maybe a part of his Civil War career that wasn't going to not make the highlight films. Now, you all know Edward Porter Alexander. Let's see if I can work this machine here. Edward Porter Alexander, the famous Confederate artillerist, thought that, quote, the initial struggle for Petersburg was the most interesting point in the whole military history of the Confederacy. Now, you may or may not agree with Colonel Alexander, but had Petersburg been captured in mid-June of 1864, the trajectory of the American Civil War would have changed dramatically and certainly would have been shortened by many months. So my talk this evening is going to address the bloody combat of those 4 June days in 1864, as well as Grant's movement from Cold Harbor to the Petersburg area. Really it's sort of a tale of 2 aspects of Grant's generalship. Now, speaking of our hero, here he is. The Petersburg campaign, of course, has its origins in the appointment of Ulysses S. Grant as General-in-Chief of all Union armies, Lieutenant General, in the spring of 1864. Grant brought 2 strategic principles to his new job. First, apply simultaneous pressure across all theaters of the war. And second, in Virginia, he chose to make his headquarters with George G. Meade's Army of the Potomac, and he told Meade to pursue relentless offensive operations against the Army of Northern Virginia and Robert E. Lee. Grant would implement these plans in May of 1864, launching his protege, William T. Sherman, on an offensive into North Georgia aimed at destroying the Army of Tennessee and capturing the city of Atlanta. And in Virginia, he would have Meade focus laser-like on Lee's army and then institute 2 subordinate offensives, sending Benjamin Butler and the Army of the James up the James River to the south side of the Richmond-Petersburg area, and to send a body of troops up the Shenandoah Valley under Franz Sigel. Now, both of those auxiliary campaigns failed in mid-May, Sigel being defeated at Newmarket and Butler being turned back into Bermuda Hundred at Drury's Bluff. Now, the Army of the Potomac, now I'm going to have a bunch of maps here, and some of them are going to be a little too detailed for even our purposes, but I think most of you, can you see that laser? Yeah, okay. Most of you are familiar with the outlines of the Overland Campaign. Grant will lead Meade's army to fighting at the Wilderness, at Spotsylvania Courthouse, at North Anna River, and along the Pamunkey River, and finally ending down here about 10 miles northeast of Richmond at a place called Cold Harbor. Of course, the attacks on June the 3rd at Cold Harbor failed, and Grant had pretty much run out of real estate to pursue his standard operation, which was to move to his left, Lee's right, maintaining the communications by water along Virginia's navigable rivers. That's why he moved the way he did, to be supplied first from the Potomac, then the Rappahannock, then the Pamunkey River, and ultimately the James River. But after Cold Harbor, he had run out of real estate in order to try to outflank Lee. And so he made the bold decision to cross the mighty James River and target Petersburg, 23 miles south of the Confederate capital. Now, many of you have been to Petersburg before. You know it as a very small Virginia city, only about 35,000 residents. But in 1860, Petersburg was the second largest city in Virginia, and in 1861, it would be numbered the seventh largest city in the entire Confederacy. 5 railroads led into Petersburg. All of the railroads that fed into Richmond, save for one, went through Petersburg before getting to the Confederate capital. So I think you can understand that capturing Petersburg would be tantamount to reducing the Confederate capital at Richmond. So it was an important industrial city. I won't give you a history of Petersburg here, but it was a very important town. Today, you look at it, you think it's sort of a depressed small city, but don't think that way about Petersburg in the context of the mid-century. So much was at stake as Grant informed the authorities in Washington of his intention to move south of the James. Now, Grant was only too aware of the risks involved in this proposed operation. He had to disengage from the Confederate Army at Cold Harbor, and as most of you know, the armies were in very close contact at Cold Harbor. So he had to disengage from that contest and move across to Petersburg. That would be a 50-mile hike, and he had to do it in a way that would get a lead on Robert E. Lee, who would have interior lines, in other words, a shorter route to get to Petersburg than Grant would have. Grant's first obstacle in getting down to the James River was to cross the bridgeless, swampy Chickahominy River. And then he had to get to the James, which was in many places as wide as 4,000 feet and 80 feet deep. If Grant was caught while he was trying to cross the James River, an army is extremely vulnerable when it's in the process of crossing a river. And even another danger to this operation was the danger to Butler's Army of the James, ensconced in that Bermuda Hundred Peninsula between Richmond and Petersburg, because, hey, the Army of the James wouldn't have the Army of the Potomac there to help it, and Lee could easily turn on Butler while Grant was conducting this long march and destroy the Army of the James. So this was no-brainer decision to go to Petersburg. It was a very, very tough decision. And Grant would conduct this movement to the James almost flawlessly, employing speed, stealth, and deception, along with some solid planning to do what Porter Alexander again would call, quote, the most brilliant piece of logistics of the war. Here's a very complicated map that we don't really need to try to understand at this point, but just looking at the various routes, you get an idea that Grant was assigning the various corps of his army different routes so they didn't all clog up on one road. Now, there would be 5 corps of troops, about 90,000 men involved in this movement. The 2nd Corps, the 5th Corps with the Iron Brigade in it, the 6th Corps and the 9th Corps, all belonging to the Army of the Potomac, and the elements of the 18th Corps, which was part of Baldy Smith's Corps in the Army of the James. It would follow the river route back down the Pamunkey River to the York River to Hampton Roads, then up the James River to get back to Petersburg. Now, Grant realized that he had to do this with stealth. He had to basically fool Lee. And one of the things he did was to send 2/3 of his cavalry under Phil Sheridan north and west towards the Virginia Central Railroad. Now, he wanted to have Sheridan link up with David Hunter's army that was being victorious. Hunter was the successor to Sigel in the Shenandoah Valley. Where Sigel failed, Hunter succeeded. And Hunter was going to move east along the Virginia Central Railroad. Sheridan was going to move west, and they would destroy that rail line. But in addition, Grant understood that if he detached most of his cavalry to the northwest, what would Lee do? Lee would counter by detaching most of his cavalry to deal with Sheridan. And if Lee was bereft of most of his cavalry, what would that do to aid Grant's deceptive movement to the James? So that's this. I guess is Eric Wittenberg coming next in September? Well, Eric has written, the book on the Battle of Trevilian Station, and maybe he's going to talk about that, the June 11th and 12th Battle of 1864. Anyway, so Sheridan is gone. Now Grant arranges for a motley fleet of ferry boats to be assembled from all over the Atlantic coast to ferry the troops across the James River. And he also assigns engineer troops to build a pontoon bridge at a place to be located. Grant didn't know exactly where the best place to put this bridge would be, but it would be, when it was completed, the longest military bridge, as someone said, since the days of Xerxes. Now, this is a little less detailed map, and it shows you the routes of the various corps. There's Burnside and the 9th Corps heading down in this direction. Here's the Cold Harbor area right here. Here's Smith with the 18th Corps from the Army of the James. He's heading for White House Landing on the Pamunkey River, where he's going to board boats and head down the river to get eventually to come up the James. Now, that's also part of a deception, because the Confederates realized that there were a lot of Yankees getting on boats at White House Landing, but where were they going? Many Union units in June of 1864 had experienced the expiration of their terms of enlistment and were taking boats going back north. So that could have been exactly what these Federal troops were doing, heading back to end their war. Then you see the 6th Corps under Horatio Wright, the 2nd Corps under Winfield Scott Hancock, and here is the 5th Corps under Gouverneur Warren, all heading for crossings on the swampy Chickahominy River here. Now, the Chickahominy was bridgeless. If any of you have been maybe on 7 days tours or have been in this part of the world, you know that that Chickahominy River can look like just one giant swamp. The Confederates had destroyed all the bridges. One officer described it as a wide ditch partly choked with rotten logs and full of brown, tepid, sickly-looking water whose slow current would scarcely carry a straw along. Now, the plan called for crossing the Chickahominy at 3 different points, with engineers building pontoon bridges, and that part of the operation went flawlessly. Now, deception. Grant also wanted Lee to believe that his next move was going to be in the footsteps of George McClellan's Peninsula Campaign, which operated on the roads north of the James River and towards a crossroads that we know as Glendale, or sometimes it's called Riddell's Shop, right here. So, what Grant ordered me to do was to send 2 divisions of Warren's Corps, along with a brigade of cavalry, towards the Glendale intersection to make Lee believe that that's where the Army was heading. Going to fight in the same location that McClellan did. Of course, you all know about the Battle of Glendale or Frazier's Farm or Riddell's Shop on June 30th, 1862, one of the big battles of the 7 Days Battle. And there was a skirmish there, a pretty good skirmish. Lee, of course, realizes the Yankees are gone when he wakes up on the morning of June the 12th. But where are they going? And here they are. They're down at Glendale. And so Lee sends the 2 remaining infantry corps that he has in his army. The 1st Corps under Richard H. Anderson, and the 3rd Corps under Ambrose Powell Hill. Where's the 2nd Corps? 2nd Corps is out in the Shenandoah Valley. Lee had detached Jubal Early and his 2nd Corps to go out and deal with the threat to his figurative left flank out in the Shenandoah Valley. So Lee's infantry has been reduced to just 2 corps. And that's really one of the, this is a 2-second digression, but the Overland Campaign was not a successful campaign for Grant. He loses 60,000 men, doesn't win any of these battles, but what he has done is emasculate the Army of Northern Virginia. He has turned the Army of Northern Virginia into an impotent offensive weapon. It's still tough on the defense, but on the offense, Lee doesn't have enough men to go on the offense. So Lee is just responding to what Grant is doing down there at Glendale. Now, I would be misleading you if I told you that Lee was completely unaware of the possibility that Grant was heading for the James River. Lee was certainly sensible to that possibility of a Union attempt. And in fact, he wrote to Jefferson Davis predicting that it was likely at some point that Grant would attempt to cross the James River. But what was Lee's primary responsibility at this time? To protect Richmond. And so his first job was to make sure that Richmond, the most important city in the Confederacy, was protected. And so he would maintain his position on the north side of the James, counting on his colleague south of the James, P.G.T. Beauregard, to inform him of any threat to the Petersburg area. Now, because all of Meade's pontoons were required to span the Chickahominy, Grant placed Butler in charge of bridging the James River. And Butler would dispatch his chief engineer, a man named Godfrey Weitzel, and some other engineers to locate the best place to build the pontoon bridge and to actually assemble the equipment and do the construction necessary to build this bridge. They would build it at a place called the Wyandotte Peninsula, which was about 20-some miles below the confluence of the Appomattox and James Rivers at City Point. It was one of the most narrow places on the James River. It was a little over 2,000 feet. That's a pretty hefty river, but still less wide than other places. But the problem was that the north bank was very swampy and would require a long causeway to be built, and the south bank would require ramps in order to link the bridge to the local road network. And Weitzel was able to assemble all of this material and began building this bridge, and by midnight on June 14 and 15, it was ready to be constructed. Now, as the Union Army is moving down towards the James, they are able to get, especially with Hancock's Second Corps, able to get right down here to here's the Wyandotte Peninsula. Here's the location of these pontoon bridges right here. And everybody is moving down in good fashion. The only portion of the federal forces that are not on schedule is the wagon train. The wagon train is over here, and it has discovered that its designated crossing point of the Chickahominy was impractical. They needed more pontoons than they had. All the pontoons were being employed other places, so the wagon train was going to be behind the rest of the army. But everybody else had done a very good job of getting down to the river with Hancock in the lead. June 14th, Hancock's Second Corps, Wright's Sixth Corps, Burnside's Ninth Corps, and most of Warren's Fifth Corps were on the north bank in a position to cross, having negotiated the intervening ground virtually without any Confederate interference whatsoever. Meanwhile, Smith's 18th Corps had moved up the James River, preparing to disembark at Bermuda Hundred. As I said, only the supply wagons, guarded by the Black Division of the Ninth Corps, was not on schedule. Grant, frankly, I mean, we could go into if you want to read a lot about this, I have a chapter in my book about this, but there's about 4 chapters on this in Gordon Ray's last volume of the Overland Campaign called On to Petersburg. Gordon has done a great job of parsing all of this out, and it's one of the finest logistical maneuvers of the entire Civil War. He had basically stolen a march on Robert E. Lee, and now all he had to do was advance on Petersburg, overwhelm the thin line of defenders there, and reap the benefits of forcing Lee either to fight for his communications, accept a siege of Richmond, or abandon the Confederate capital. All right, now, as I have mentioned, Lee was perfectly cognizant of the possibility that sooner or later Grant would shift his operations to the south side. Now, and this is Baldy Smith here. What have we got here? Yeah, that's fine. We'll go back to General Lee here. When Beauregard defeated a federal attempt to capture Petersburg on June the 9th, which is to say 3 days prior to Grant's movement, in what was just celebrated, yesterday, it was called the Battle of Old Men and Young Boys. It's the one battle at Petersburg that the local citizens always celebrated. I don't know in these days if they're still doing it or not, but they always celebrated the Battle of Old Men and Young Boys on June the 9th, in which some volunteers, 125 old men and graybeards, came out from their homes in Petersburg and turned back the Butler's attempt to capture Petersburg on June 9th. Beauregard saw the portents of an ominous offensive. He thought this was a signal of what was going to happen next. But Lee, who was uncertain of Grant's intentions, declined to consider Butler's movement on June 9th as anything more than a failed reconnaissance. No troops have left General Grant's army, Lee reassured the nervous Beauregard. and none could have crossed James River without being perceived. Now, Lee's confidence in the ability to counter any federal move derived from his own intelligence gathering capabilities and Beauregard's line of scouts that were scattered along the James River. All right. Still, Lee would shift Robert Hoke's division, and let me see if I can't find. Hoke would be moving down here. You see Hoke. This is where the Confederates had their pontoon bridges across the James River, right along just north of Chaffin's Bluff, opposite Drury's Bluff here. And Hoke was a portion of Beauregard's army. Robert Hoke's division had been sent to Cold Harbor when Butler sent Smith's corps to Cold Harbor. Hoke was the answer to reinforce General Lee's army at Cold Harbor. So Lee said, all right, Hoke, you move down to the bridges just in case you're needed across there. You'll be very much closer to getting across to reinforce Beauregard. Now, by June the 14th, as Grant arranged his Petersburg offensive, Lee and Beauregard speculated about the location and intentions of their enemy. Lee responded to an inquiry from President Davis early that afternoon by speculating, quote, that I think the enemy must be preparing to move south of the James. Lee knew that the Federals were moving south and that large numbers of Yankees had boarded boats at White House Landing. But this could mean that Grant was changing his base to Harrison's Landing, where he could be resupplied in preparation for a renewal of the previous day's attack at Glendale, and that the shipboard troops were on their way north, their terms of enlistment having expired. We ought to be extremely watchful and guarded, Lee advised, but alertness did not equate to shifting focus from Richmond to Petersburg. Now, Beauregard, who was in command of a separate department, not under Lee's orders at this point, was much less ambivalent regarding Grant's intentions. He beseeched the War Department to return Hoke's division immediately, warning that if some combination of Butler's and Meade's army attacked him, quote, I cannot answer for consequences. When this appeal elicited no response, Beauregard took matters into his own hands and sent orders to Hoke on the night of June 14th to move immediately across the James to reinforce him. He also sent staff officers to Lee to justify the shift. But in the absence of hard evidence that Grant was crossing the river and Beauregard's penchant for the fantastic, General Lee remained uncommitted to sending any more of the army to reinforce Beauregard. Now, while Beauregard fretted and Lee remained cautious, Grant and Meade proceeded on June 14th with their offensive plans. Now, here's our friend, William Farrar Baldy Smith. In Grant's mind, Smith's 3 divisions would be solely responsible for capturing Petersburg. Smith's 18th Corps had boarded their transports on June the 13th, and by the next day began a staggered arrival at Bermuda Hundred, or up the Appomattox River at Broadway Landing and Point of Rocks. This disembarkation began on the afternoon of June 14th and continued until well after dark. Okay. Meanwhile, this fellow, Winfield Hancock, had received his orders on the morning of the 14th to cross the James River at the site of the pontoon bridge, which was not quite yet finished. So they began getting on that motley fleet of ferry boats about noon and began crossing the James. Before noon, well, most of one of the divisions was on board, and shortly thereafter, they had reached, about 1 o'clock, they'd reached the right bank, delighting the veterans, such as this New Jersey soldier who had grown disenchanted with the Virginia landscape. who wrote, "As we steamed across the beautiful river, our hearts were filled with new hope. We had bidden farewell to the swamp and miasmata of the Chickahominy, to the long lines of graves that stretched not only across the peninsula, but across the hills and valleys and streams and through the fertile fields and tangled swamps of Virginia, up to the Rapidan. We were bidding farewell to the old battlefields and entering upon a new field of operations." It would take to nearly dawn on June the 15th to ferry Hancock's 3 divisions across the river. But by 5 a.m. on June 15th, the entire Second Corps was comfortably encamped on the south bank, many of the men cleansing the grime of 40 days of campaigning by taking swims in the James. Hancock remained himself on the north bank of the river, communicating by signal flag to the far bank. He confirmed to Meade that he had 3 days' rations on hand, contradicting an earlier erroneous report that his corps would be out of food that night. Now, while the engineers finished the bridge and Hancock's troops ferried across the river, Grant boarded a steamer and met with Butler at Bermuda Hundred to outline his plans for the attack. And there's Beast Butler, who you recognize. Grant told Butler that he would be solely responsible for the attack because Hancock would require reprovisioning before marching toward Petersburg. And with Meade's wagons, as you know, stalled on the other side of the Chickahominy, it would be up to Butler's army to provide those rations to Hancock. About 60,000 rations. And Butler said that he would ferry them down the river by boat and deliver them to Hancock. Without this precaution, the services of this corps cannot be had for an emergency tomorrow. Those are important words. This is what Grant told Butler. An emergency. What does that tell you? Well, you're in charge, but if there's an emergency, Hancock will help you. But you got to feed him before he can help you. But we already know that Hancock has told Meade, I don't need any more rations. You're starting to see the plan begin to unfold here. This message not only implied that Grant considered Hancock's participation in the June 15th offensive as necessary only in an emergency, but he was unaware of Hancock's supply situation. Grant returned to the north side of the James by sunset on the 14th, informed Meade of Butler's supply mission, because by 10 p.m., Meade sent a message to Hancock that he should await delivery and distribution of rations before embarking on the long march to Petersburg, ignoring Hancock's earlier report that he was well supplied. So as it unfolded on the morning of June 15th, multiple misunderstandings about the imminent arrival of these unnecessary supplies froze the Second Corps in its camps, as Hancock obeyed Meade's directive to postpone his departure. A course of action Hancock was certainly unlikely to have followed if he had understood that his presence was required in the operation against Petersburg. Ultimately, the supply ships failed to arrive as promised, so about 10:30 in the morning on June 15th, Meade released Hancock to begin his trek toward Petersburg. Thus, nearly 6 hours were wasted between the time that the Second Corps was united on the south bank of the river and the departure for the front. 6 hours that might have changed American history. As for the 18th Corps, Grant's orders for Butler were to begin Smith's march toward Petersburg that night and launch his attack as soon after dawn as possible. Okay? Now, Grant assumed that Smith would capture Petersburg that morning and that Hancock would be available later that day to help Smith hold the city should Lee try to redeem the situation. Smith would have with him the 2 white divisions of his army, of his corps, that arrived from Cold Harbor, 2 brigades taken from the Bermuda Hundred lines, about 2,500 cavalry under August V. Kautz, and 3,700 African-American troops from City Point under Edward Hincks, a total of about 14,000 men. However, Smith would claim that he had learned nothing of these attack plans until late on the 14th, as the last of his troops disembarked from their boats. It would take time to organize his men, who landed at various places absent any division integrity. Smith must then cross the Appomattox River in the dark, march 5 miles toward Petersburg before deploying for his attack. In short, Grant's expectation of a dawn offensive on the 15th of June against Petersburg was a fantasy, an echo of the poor planning that had plagued Hancock's departure. 5 men, Grant, Meade, Butler, Hancock, and Smith, all needed to be on the same page for this operation to succeed. But Grant failed to communicate his plans to all of his subordinates. And thus, like the University of Minnesota, which drives down to the Badgers' 3-yard line and then fumbles the ball, Grant jeopardized his potential payoff for his brilliant march to the James. Now, P.G.T. Beauregard had been in command of something called the Department of North Carolina and Virginia, Southern Virginia, since April 23rd, a vast authority that extended from the mouth of the Cape Fear River below Wilmington, North Carolina, all the way to the south side of the James. The Virginia portion of his domain was called the 1st Military District and was under the command of former Virginia Governor Henry A. Wise. Wise had authority over the garrison troops in the district, while Bushrod Dixon's infantry division bore responsibility for containing Butler at Bermuda Hundred, behind a compact defensive line about 3.5 miles long, anchored on the left on the James and on the right on the Appomattox, called the Howlett Line. The Howlett Line. He had about 3,300 men along that Howlett Line. At Petersburg, an elaborate defensive perimeter that extended nearly 10 miles anchored on the Appomattox River below the town, running down to the south, then to the west, then back to the north, anchored on the Appomattox River above Petersburg, featuring 55 artillery batteries connected with infantry curtains, all those batteries with infantry curtains, called the Dummock Line, was defended by only about 4,000 men. Some scattered regiments under General Wise, and a large group of militia, with about 22 pieces of artillery. Most of that Dummock Line was entirely undefended because Beauregard had such a small force. No wonder Beauregard was desperate to get Hoke's 6,600 men back to his army. But despite his orders the previous night, Hoke would not start to cross the James until noon on the 15th. So, as the day's events would unfold, Beauregard would be on his own. Once informed of his assignment, Smith quickly organized his arriving infantry, many of whom enjoyed little or no sleep that evening, beginning their march across 2 pontoon bridges spanning the Appomattox River. The Smith's plan called for Kautz's cavalry to lead the way, dispersing any resistance outside of the Dummock Line, and allowing the infantry to march directly against the works, according to Butler, that were very thinly held by Confederate defenders. The Federals began their march between 2 and 3 in the morning of June 15th, but Kautz was delayed in crossing the bridge, and not until 5 o'clock, nearly a half an hour after dawn, would Smith's 2 divisions arrive to join Hincks on the south bank of the Appomattox. Now, the Union cavalry rode ahead as directed, but ran into a stubborn Confederate force on high ground at a place known as the Baylor Farm. And here's the Baylor Farm, and here is this small blocking force of artillery and cavalry manned by Graham's Petersburg Battery and James Deering's cavalry. Unfortunately, that part of the battlefield has been wiped out by an interstate interchange today, so if that doesn't look familiar to you who have come to Petersburg, it's because it's a disappearing battlefield. It's a disappeared battlefield. Couts declared that the resistance was too strong for mere cavalry to overwhelm, so Smith called on Hinks's troops to drive away the rebels. The blacks lurched ahead in what was their first real combat, absorbing significant casualties from a single cavalry regiment supported by this one battery of artillery. Eventually, the 400 or 500 Graycoats did fall back, giving the black troops a hard-earned victory accompanied by a sinister byproduct: the intimidation of Baldy Smith. At a most unexpected place, I had been called upon to develop my force and make an assault, and this fact caused me at once to cease taking anything for granted that had been asserted, Smith would explain. Grant's dawn attack, already a moot point, would now face further delay. Smith resumed his advance, but with extreme caution, halting on every intervening ridge between Baylor's Farm and the Demock line. Not until afternoon did the Federals pull up opposite the Confederate defenses, and then Smith would deploy his 3 divisions from the Appomattox River on his right, with Hinks's division on the left and the cavalry extending even farther to the left. All along the line, rebel cannon belched out at their new targets, inflicting minor casualties, but further persuading Smith that, contrary to Butler's assertions, the Confederates were strongly positioned. Smith opted to conduct an extensive reconnaissance to identify targets for his assault, taking almost all afternoon to focus on a strong point on the Confederate line called Battery 5, a salient near the City Point Railroad. Now, let me get you oriented on this map. This is the area where Smith is going to make his attack, right in here. Meanwhile, what happened to our friend Hancock? Remember him. He's finally left his campground near the crossings, and he personally was riding in an ambulance because by this time his old Gettysburg wound had begun festering and he was unable to mount his horse, and that probably contributed to some of these bad outcomes as well because he was immobile. He was confined to an ambulance. His men wilted under the unrelenting heat, very hot that day, almost 100 degrees, traversing poor roads and armed with faulty maps, so inadequate that Francis Barlow's division marched the wrong direction and became lost. And you see Barlow going off in this direction here. Not until about 5:30 in the afternoon did David Birney's division reach a crossroads about 4 miles outside of Petersburg. Here, breathless couriers arrived with urgent orders ordering Hancock to immediately support Smith's impending attack. Hancock was shocked by these urgent orders. He had no idea that he was expected to participate in any attack that morning or that afternoon, and he struggled to determine exactly where Smith was located. The same lack of an informed guiding hand that had delayed Hancock's march compromised the ability of Smith and Hancock to cooperate, with Meade completely out of the command loop, Butler doing little to encourage Smith to attack, and Grant passively relying on Butler to keep him apprised, seemingly unconcerned that his offensive had been so long delayed. Well, this map is a little bit small, but let me talk briefly about Smith's attack. His personal reconnaissance that afternoon, an exercise that required about 2 hours, identified a ravine between batteries 6 and 7. And if you have been to Petersburg, national battlefield. The visitor center is right by Battery 6, and that ravine that Smith identified as his route of attack would be the route today of Highway 36, the access road that leads you, the highway that leads you into the battlefield park if you've been there. That ravine is still very much there today. Even so, Smith worried that if the works contained a strong complement of infantry to support the obvious artillery presence, any attack would fail. My best chance of success was to trust to a very heavy skirmish line, which would not of itself attract much artillery fire and which would yet be sufficient to do the work if the enemy was not very strong in infantry, Smith explained. Troops from William Brooks's division would initiate the attack, and supported by assaults by John Martindale's division on his right and Hinks's African Americans division on his left. And I don't know, those labels are pretty small up there, but here's Martindale, here's Brooks, here's Hinks along this vicinity here. And the Battery 5 area is right in here. And this would be the ravine that he would use to try to get in behind that battery. Smith further thought that it would be useful to degrade Beauregard's artillery defenses by bombarding them, and he called on his artillery commander to bring forward the guns, but then the artillery commander had taken the horses back to be watered, so the guns could move forward. That is another little delay that puts us now to 7 o'clock that night. Well, then the guns open briefly, and the attack takes place about 7 o'clock. The infantry went forward, they penetrated through that ravine and behind batteries 5 and 6, and also threatened them from the front. The entire complement of Confederate artillery surrendered, along with most of its supporting infantry. On Brooks's right, Martindale's scattered defenders scattered the Confederate defenders at batteries 4 and 3, while the black troops accomplished even more, successfully assaulting batteries 7 and 8, and then compelling the Confederates to abandon batteries 9 and 10, a landmark achievement which earned the black troops grudging respect from their white comrades. By the time darkness had enveloped this blood-soaked landscape, Smith had conquered about 2 miles of the Confederates' Demock line, had captured at least 13 guns, and inflicted hundreds of casualties. Now the question remained, what would the Federals do with this tardy but decisive victory? With Barlow's division lost, Hancock had only 2 divisions, Birney's and John Gibbon's, in position to respond to the urgent messages to assist Smith. But poor communications and the confusing geography conspired to delay their arrival until after dark, and when the serious fighting had just about run its course. Hancock met with Smith about 9 p.m., just about the time it got too dark to see anything, who explained what had transpired and pointed out the extent of his achievement. Hancock confirmed that Birney and Gibbon were available to continue the offensive. Although Hancock outranked Smith, he deferred to his junior's judgment, desiring, as he said, not to interfere with his honor as he was directed to take the place. Smith declined to resume the attack, requesting only that Hancock's 2 divisions relieve Brooks and Hinks at the front and prepare to meet any Confederate counterattack. So the 2nd Corps units stumbled forward in the dark, and by 11 o'clock they had relieved the 18th Corps troops along the captured Confederate line, as you see on that map. Now, one of the enduring questions when I started out on this quest, which seems like a lifetime sentence to write the story of the Petersburg campaign, was to try to evaluate whether Smith and Hancock had made the right decision that night. Of course, there were many bitter recriminations among some of the Union troops then and later about their failure to go forward. For example, a private in the 4th U.S. Artillery remembered that gradually the fact that we were not to fight that night impressed itself upon us. The rage of the intelligent enlisted men was devilish. The most blood-curdling blasphemy I ever listened to, I heard that night, uttered by men who knew they were to be sacrificed in the morning. Many blamed Smith, such as the staff officer who believed that Petersburg would have gone like a rotten branch had Smith exercised sufficient courage. Other critics cited the bright moonlight that would have guided the Federals into what was presumed to be a nearly defenseless city. Now, it's certainly easy to condemn Baldy Smith, a rather unlovable character, frankly, whose post-war apologia reeked with prevarication. But I think to do so is a little too simplistic. Although Hancock is blameless for his Corps' protracted march from the James on June 15th, he certainly could have insisted upon a coordinated advance after 9 o'clock, if in his judgment such an attack was warranted. He did not. Neither of the Army commanders, Butler or Meade, set foot anywhere near the scene of action, nor did Grant, whose headquarters at City Point were barely an hour's ride distant. Any of these three men had the authority to order an advance, but they did not. Smith would cite a plethora of reasons for his decision to discontinue the assault, chief among them the darkness and the disorganization of his troops, particularly the blacks. Smith also believed that by capturing batteries 3 through 10, he had put artillery close enough to Petersburg to bombard it into submission. Perhaps most of all, Smith expressed concern that the Confederates had been reinforced, and to plunge his troops into the darkness against an enemy of unknown strength would have been, in his words, simple madness, and would have almost inevitably resulted in disaster and the loss of all that we had gained. Now, in hindsight, I think we can conclude that had Hancock and Smith gone forward that night, and that they probably would have captured Petersburg. We don't know that, but probably would have. But in my judgment, I think they acted reasonably. And in fact, the Confederates were gaining in strength. Now, General Beauregard had arrived in Petersburg that night from his headquarters north of the Appomattox about 6 o'clock. The attack that quickly followed didn't surprise him, as he had been predicting such an eventuality all day. But now the question was simple for Beauregard. Should he defend Petersburg by stripping the defenses of Bermuda Hundred, or forsake the Cockade City and hold the Howlett Line? Beauregard had unsuccessfully asked Richmond for advice on that very question all day, so it was up to him to make that decision. Not long after the Federal breakthrough, the leading elements of Hoke's division finally began to arrive in Petersburg in the form of Johnson Haygood's 1,400 South Carolinians, much to the delight of the now panic-stricken citizens in Petersburg. Haygood initially received instructions to move to extend the Confederate right, but when word of the breakthrough on the eastern end of the Demock Line reached Petersburg, Haygood was told to go in that direction to try to stem the tide. He almost stumbled into the Federals in the dark, but eventually, with the aid of Beauregard's very competent engineer, a man named David B. Harris, he drew a new line along a tributary of the Appomattox River called Harrison's Creek, created a nice valley with high ground on the top, connecting the initial Confederate defenses at Battery 2 and Battery 15. Let's see if I can point that out to you. So I'm having a hard time seeing these maps myself. But here we are down here around Battery 15, and Battery 2 is up in this vicinity. So this would be the new Haygood defensive line right here, with the old captured Demock line being this here. During the night, Alfred Colquitt's Georgia Brigade and the North Carolinians under James Martin and Thomas Clingman extended the line, digging furiously to create an earthwork barrier. In the meantime, Beauregard made the decision to abandon the Howlett Line and bring Bushrod Johnson's division to Petersburg, giving him a total of about 11,000 troops to meet the combined forces of Smith and Hancock, who would outnumber the Confederates 3-1. Beauregard informed Lee of his decision and begged Lee to replace Johnson's troops before Butler, discovering that the Howlett Line was abandoned, moved west to sever the railroad and road connections between Richmond and Petersburg. In the pre-dawn hours of June 16th, Lee ordered George Pickett's division of about 4,500 men to cross the James for this purpose. So how would the Federal command react to this dynamic and evolving situation on June 16th? Now, Lee put Pickett's division on the road about 3 in the morning, and a few hours later, Charles Field's division of the 1st Corps also started for the south side. However, alert Union officers in Butler's lines at Bermuda 100 detected suspicious sounds during the night, and an early daylight probed forward. The few troops Johnson had left behind quickly took to their heels, and although a fraction of Butler's available strength was committed to this advance, as you can see by those arrows, some of Butler's men reached the Richmond and Petersburg Railroad. Now, I hope that is obvious how important it would be to hold those connections. If the Yankees held the road and the railroad between Richmond and Petersburg, how could Lee get troops to reinforce Beauregard? So this is another critical aspect of this operation. Meanwhile, while this is going on at Bermuda 100, Burnside's 9th Corps and Warren's 5th Corps began using the now completed pontoon bridge across the James River, along with the ferry boats, to extend Hancock's left. At the same time, Johnson's Graycoats crossed the Appomattox and extended the new Confederate defensive perimeter, dubbed the Haygood Line, to mirror Hancock's deployment. Throughout the day, the 2nd and 18th Corps crept cautiously forward, discovering the new rebel defenses. Grant ordered Burnside and Warren to provide flank protection to Hancock, while the 2nd and 18th Corps spent the day trying to find positions to make an attack. As the Federals probed, the Confederates dug, so that by late on the afternoon of the 16th, the Confederate line was reasonably formidable. Meanwhile, back at Bermuda 100, Butler committed only about 2 brigades of his entire force to the occupation and destruction of the vital railroad link between Richmond and Petersburg. As a result of this, when Pickett's division arrived on the scene, they easily drove Butler's men back into their fortifications and secured the link between Richmond and Petersburg. When Field's division arrived late in the day, the opportunity to block additional reinforcements from Lee to Beauregard evaporated. This was as big a mistake on the Union part, on Butler's part, as you might say Smith and Hancock's decision the night before. Meanwhile, south of the Appomattox, Meade ordered the attack, and it was mostly done by the 2nd Corps. Now, they were able to dent the Confederate line. They captured batteries 12 and 13, but didn't really do much more than that. However, this attack convinced Beauregard that his new Haygood Line was probably already going to be compromised, and he sent his engineer officer, David Harris, to begin constructing a 3rd defensive line even closer to Petersburg. During the day, Lee had pressed Beauregard no fewer than 4 times for information about Meade's whereabouts. Now you can imagine, Lee is sitting up north of the James. Where is the Union Army? Beauregard, where are they? Are they in front of you? Now, at 9:30 that morning, Beauregard had sent a message to Lee saying, hey, the 2nd Corps is down here. But that message went to Lee's headquarters on the north side of the James. And by then, Lee was in the process of moving his headquarters to the south of the James. So that order never reached Lee, or that message never reached Lee. Not until late that night did Lee understand that the Second Corps now was in front of Petersburg. It's a mystery to me how Beauregard could have missed the arrival of the Ninth Corps and the Fifth Corps, not to mention how his scouts missed a 2,000-foot long pontoon bridge and a fleet of ferry boats conveying 50,000 men across the James River. I cannot explain how Beauregard missed that, but he did. So there were communication problems on the Confederate side in this story as well. Thus, Lee contented himself with shifting Kershaw's division, the last of the First Corps, closer to the pontoon bridge, while keeping A.P. Hill's Third Corps on the north side in position to defend Richmond against what was now a phantom force. After the fighting had died out on the evening of June 16th, Grant informed me that Butler reported as many as 50,000 troops had been spotted between Malvern Hill and Deep Bottom on the north side of the James. Grant admitted, however, quote, that not knowing appearances in front of you, I cannot give positive directions how far or how hard you should push in the morning. I will leave this to your judgment, knowing that you will push any advantage that may be gained. Thus, the General-in-Chief continued to delegate complete operational responsibility to Meade. I don't know how many of you have read that once Grant got to the Army of the Potomac, Meade just became an executive officer, a functionary, not the case at Petersburg. This is Meade's show almost entirely. The Pennsylvanian didn't hesitate. He passed the information on to Hancock and Burnside, encouraging those officers to launch an attack to exploit the huge, if possibly fleeting, numerical advantage over the beleaguered Beauregard. Hancock's corps had been bloodied on the 16th, so the primary offensive responsibility on the 17th would belong to Burnside's corps. Now, Burnside's Black Division had not yet crossed the James, so he would have the services of only his 3 White divisions. And during the course of June 17th, each of these divisions would venture separate assaults, never achieving coordination with each other or with the 2nd and 5th Corps on their flanks. Now, the first of those divisional attacks would belong to Robert Potter's division. He targeted the southern flank of Beauregard's defenses, centered on a high knoll occupied by something called the Shand House. And there's the Shand House, and I'm happy to say that the American Battlefield Trust is in the process of buying some of that land now, which would open up a brand new battlefield site for all of us to see one day. Potter's men crept to the base of the high hill that night, and at dawn charged up the slope, scattering Wise's Virginians and Matt Ransom's Tar Heels while decimating Fulton's Tennessee Brigade and capturing some 600 men, along with all 4 of the artillery pieces on Shands Hill. Potter expected that his victory would be exploited by the 2nd Corps on his right and reinforcements from James Ledley's 9th Corps Division in his rear, but neither of these units advanced, Ledley citing terrain too difficult to navigate, and Hancock's men claiming, I think with dubious veracity, that they had never received orders to attack. It was the same story again, a most spirited and gallant assault without adequate supports, observed a soldier in the 36th Massachusetts. Had a single corps been on the ground in position, or had the divisions which were ordered to support us been ready to advance, the fearful carnage of the 2 succeeding days would doubtless have been prevented, and the long, tedious, wasting, bloody siege of Petersburg might have been avoided. Orlando B. Wilcox's 9th Corps Division had spent the night behind the 2nd Corps, but about 10 o'clock on the morning of the 17th, they moved to a deep ravine east of the Shandhouse Ridge. Burnside assigned his chief engineer, the eccentric Major James St. Clair Morton, to identify the most likely place for Wilcox's attack. Morton selected the terrain north of the Shand House, that's illustrated on this map. And Wilcox's men, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, boiled out of their protective ravine, hampered by a faulty tactical alignment arranged by Morton. That was exacerbated by Morton's order in the middle of the assault to make a right wheel. And as those arrows would suggest to you, as the Federals turned to the right, they exposed their left flank for 200 yards of fire from these Confederate forces here. Wilcox's men took terrible casualties. Morton paid for his mistake with his life, and Wilcox's attackers fled back to the Second Corps line. Now, it seems as though our blue coats lay there thickly as sheaves of grain on a bountiful harvest field, wrote a Wisconsin soldier. Verily, he said, it was a harvest of death. Now, the final Ninth Corps attack of the day came from the division commanded by James H. Ledlie. Now, Ledlie would become infamous, if that name is familiar to you, he'd become infamous for his role at the Battle of the Crater the next month. But his flaws have already been apparent to any careful observer. His previous combat experience at the North Anna River in May featured a drunken and unauthorized attack. By the time his division received their orders to assault on the late afternoon of June 17th, Ledlie was so inebriated he couldn't stand up. The supply of artificial courage which he had taken carried him beyond the proper counterpoise and rendered him hors de combat, in which condition he remained in the ravine, explained a Massachusetts captain. One of Ledlie's brigade commanders led the assault, which began just shortly before sunset. The Federals struck Wise's regiments and a portion of Stephen Elliott's South Carolinians and collapsed the Confederate defenses. But by 10 o'clock that evening, the Federals ran out of steam and ammunition, and a series of Confederate counterattacks regained the lost ground. The fighting finally petered out about midnight. All during the day, Colonel Harris had worked diligently to identify a third line of Confederate defense closer to Petersburg. Once the combat had subsided, Beauregard's exhausted soldiers, who had now fought for 3 straight days, fell back to this new defensive position dubbed the Harris Line, about 600 to 800 yards behind the abandoned Haygood Line. The weary rebels spent what was left of the evening frantically digging. Meanwhile, at Bermuda 100, Pickett had restored all of the works that had been lost the day before, while Butler seemed content with the defensive, despite having been reinforced by 2 divisions of the 6th Corps. As frustrating as the Federal performance must have been on June 17th, to Meade, Robert E. Lee suffered his own measure of anxiety that day. At daybreak, again, he pressed Beauregard to identify his opponents. The Creole commander replied that he was facing 2 corps, presumably the 2nd and 18th Corps, still failing to acknowledge the presence of Burnside and Warren. At 11:15, Beauregard compounded the confusion by informing Lee that Warren had probably gone to the Piedmont to fight early, and if he was reinforced, he could drive the Yankees back into the James. But then a couple of hours later, Beauregard wrote, "I'm being heavily pressed. If you don't send me reinforcements, I probably won't be able to hold Petersburg." Now, what is Lee reacting to all these mercurial and contradictory messages from Beauregard? The mystery was finally solved about 4:30 that afternoon, when Lee told Beauregard, "I have no information about Grant's crossing James River," but he still ordered Hill and Kershaw to get close to the James. He's still hedging his bets, but he's getting very close. And just then a report came from Confederate cavalry about the presence of the bridge and the crossing of the Union troops. Now, at last, Lee had the information he needed to send the rest of his army to Petersburg. So now it would be a race. Would Meade's army and Butler's army be able to capture Petersburg before Lee's troops arrived in mass? Kershaw's division would begin its march to Petersburg at 3 a.m. on June 18th, and a few hours later, Hill's corps tramped across the pontoon bridge at Chaffin's Bluff, while Field's brigades left their works at Bermuda 100 and followed to Petersburg in Kershaw's footsteps. Union forces were also on the move that morning, reacting to Meade's nighttime orders to commence a coordinated advance at daylight. 4 corps, the 18th, the 2nd, 9th, and 5th, from north to south, lurched forward, prepared to engage the Confederates. In some places they met resistance, but most of the would-be attackers encountered the abandoned Confederate Haygood Line. Surprised but undeterred, Meade told his corps commanders to prepare a new attack focused on the recently completed Harris Line. The 18th and 2nd Corps pressed forward, but soon discovered that the rebel works in their front were well prepared and adequately manned, and their efforts came to naught. Farther south, the 9th and 5th Corps never advanced at all, either claiming to be stymied by a lack of flank protection or professing that they never received mandatory orders to assault, professing that they were unable to go forward. These failures infuriated Meade, who for once lost his composure and sent orders that said, among other things, "I find it useless to appoint an hour to effect cooperation," and demanded that all 4 of his corps go forward irrespective of their support on their flanks. By this time, Kershaw had extended the Confederate right, and Field was moving into position while Hill's troops were legging it south. The Federals responded to Meade's frustrated and peremptory attack orders in uneven and what would be universally unsuccessful fashion. On the far left end of the Union line, Warren's advance ran into Johnson's men and the fresh soldiers of Kershaw's division. The brigade, commanded by a former college professor from Maine, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, charged about 3 p.m., yelling like a pack of infuriated devils, reaching the base of the Confederate works before lethal firing, pouring from cannons and rifles, stopped them cold. Colonel Chamberlain was among the casualties. He received a serious wound that was pronounced fatal, but he defied the doctor's predictions, would eventually recover, and solidified his reputation, started at Gettysburg with future service at Petersburg and Appomattox. At the other end of the line, Hancock's men poised for another effort to breach the rebel works, focusing on high ground known as Colquitt's Salient, located right here. The assault commenced between 4 and 4:30, but in the face of furious Confederate fire, most of the Federals took a few steps forward, hit the ground, having experienced enough of attacking earthworks to recognize a forlorn hope when they saw one. A large regiment of relatively green heavy artillery, now serving as infantry, were not so naive as to underestimate their peril. Nevertheless, they poured out of some defilade along the Prince George Courthouse Road and into the open field in front of Colquitt's Salient, emerging only 200 yards from the rebel line. That field became a seething hell, recalled one of the survivors of the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery. They poured it into us from the front, from the right, and from the left. In 10 minutes, 632 of the 850 men who went forward in the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery became casualties. The largest loss suffered by any single regiment in any Civil War battle. Now, the final Union spasm of the day came from Burnside's bloodied veterans, elements of whom managed to cross the Norfolk and Petersburg Railroad and approach a Confederate strong point known as Elliott's or Pegram's Salient. They, too, were unsuccessful in breaching the Confederate line, but unlike their comrades, they were able to maintain an advanced position in the ravine drained by this little tributary of the Appomattox called Poor or Taylor's Creek. And these would be the troops that would launch the attack 5 weeks later at the Battle of the Crater. That would set up the story for the Battle of the Crater. Now, Lee had arrived in Petersburg shortly before noon. He met with Beauregard at the Customs House downtown, observed the fighting near the city reservoir. The mercurial Creole urged Lee to launch a counterattack, But Lee deferred and said that he would remain on the defensive, and that decision, of course, would lead that day to all of these unsuccessful Union assaults on June the 18th. This would end the First Petersburg offensive. We triumphed at last against fearful odds in holding the invaders at bay and saving the city from the rule of the Negro and the Beast, boasted a Virginian. The Yankees has a large force, admitted a South Carolinian, but if they keep on charging, we will have them all killed in a few days. Ulysses S. Grant, for the time being at least, enough killing. Although estimates vary, my best guess is about 13,000 federal soldiers became casualties between June 15th and 18th. Confederate casualty figures are even more murky, but I would say between 2,500 and 3,000 rebels also became casualties. About 10 o'clock that evening on June the 18th, George Meade sent a summary of the day's actions to Grant, concluding by expressing great regret that I am not able to report more success, and adding, but I believe every effort to command it has been made. Grant immediately replied without a hint of condemnation. I am perfectly satisfied that all that has been done could be done. But of course, this was far from the truth. Until the arrival of the first troops from Lee's army on the morning of June 18th, Grant's forces outnumbered their Confederate opponents by as much as 5-1, odds that despite Confederate earthworks should have spelled triumph. A few weeks later, Meade confessed to a trusted staff officer that I should have taken Petersburg. I had reason to calculate on success, but he didn't. Why? The primary cause of the federal failure can be located in the condition of its troops, particularly Meade's Army of the Potomac. The Army is exhausted, admitted its commander. With 49 days of continued marching and fighting, it absolutely requires rest. Moreover, he added, we cannot replace officers with experienced men, and there is no time for reorganization or careful selection. There can be no doubt that the horrendous casualties and the consequential attrition at the line and field command level sustained from the Wilderness to Cold Harbor reduced the efficiency and esprit de corps of Meade's army. With many of his best tactical leaders and bravest fighting men laying in shallow graves or languishing in hospitals, Meade's offensive capabilities had been grossly diminished. That is not to say that the soldiers were too demoralized to fight. The long list of killed and wounded during the first offensive stands as mute testimony, but their willingness and ability to press an attack had all but vanished. There were also mistakes at the highest levels of command. Grant's failure to communicate his battle plans to all the principals involved severely compromised his chances of success on June 15th. Smith's timidity in executing his assault that day allowed reinforcements to bolster Beauregard's shattered ranks that evening, and the tardy attack meant that a push into Petersburg must occur in the dark, a risk neither Smith nor Hancock was willing to take. The hesitation and conservative mindset infected the other corps commanders, who only rarely felt sufficiently comfortable about their flanks to advance in concert with one another, leading to the piecemeal assaults that characterized the federal operations during the succeeding 4 days. Benjamin Butler fumbled a golden opportunity to sever the direct road and railroad connections between Richmond and Petersburg when he so easily surrendered his position between the two cities, allowing Lee's troops to filter to Petersburg without interference. And at least part of the overall explanation lies with the General-in-Chief, whose fingerprints were all but invisible during these days, although delegating operational decisions to his subordinates was pretty typical of Grant's generalship. Of course, the Confederates had a great deal to do with the outcome. Beauregard and his little army performed about as well as any force during the entire war. As one observer put it, with such fearful and almost incredible odds against him, General Beauregard maintained a successful barrier to the Federal advance, a feat that was almost without precedent. Well, I think that's probably overstating the case just a tad. Beauregard certainly deserves high praise for selecting his 2 new lines of defense, timing the evacuation of the old lines flawlessly, and allocating Hoke's and Johnson's brigades properly. But, you know, there's little evidence of Beauregard's influence on the combat that thwarted the Union attacks, credit for that belonging to the subordinate officers, to the limited degree that tactical improvisation characterizes fighting on the defensive. On the negative side of Beauregard's ledger, his remarkably poor intelligence and inconsistent assessment of his situation in his front contributed to Lee's hesitation to reinforce his beleaguered comrade. As for Lee, historians often cite his failure to reinforce Petersburg more quickly as one of the worst blemishes on his wartime record. Although there can be no question that Grant stole a march on the Gray Commander, and that his deception kept Lee uncertain of his enemy's whereabouts and intentions, I think Lee acted reasonably given the information available to him between June 13th and 17th. Lee's first responsibility was to protect Richmond, and without some assurance that the Federal Army was not lurking on the north side of the James, his decision to send incremental reinforcements south was reasonable and prudent. Once he had definitive information of the Federal presence at Petersburg, he acted swiftly. Now, the first offensive at Petersburg, I think, should be ranked among the most major battles of the Civil War. More than 125,000 soldiers battled for 4 days, resulting in the combined casualties approaching 16,000, numbers that correlate with the largest and bloodiest battles of the entire war. But Grant's failure to capture Petersburg would lead to 8 more offensives during the next 288 days before he achieved the victory that might have been his 9 months earlier. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We have some questions.
Go ahead and call on them. Yes, sir.
When Petersburg did fall a year later, it only took a week for the war for Appomattox to happen.
Correct.
And of course, the Army of Northern Virginia was somewhat spent by the sea. What was your history would have changed if we had taken Petersburg in 1864? Given his army was somewhat spent, as you said.
Right.
What's your speculation about how things would have been different if they had taken Petersburg?
Well, I hope everybody heard the question. Basically is what might have happened had this first offensive been successful in driving Lee out of Petersburg. It's a counterfactual question, so I don't know. The real answer is I don't know. My speculation is that Lee would probably have fallen back across the tributary of the Appomattox called Swift Creek, which was a pretty good water barrier. That was about 6 miles north of Petersburg and about 15 miles south of Richmond. And he may have, that would have been his closest defensive position, holding on to Richmond, because that was really critical. But without Petersburg's transportation connections, Lee relied on would have just one railroad to supply him, the Richmond and Danville Railroad, which bypassed Petersburg and went into Richmond from the southwest. And how long an army would have been able to sustain itself using that very limited communications route, as well as trying to feed nearly 100,000 people that had now lived in Richmond, that would have been a major problem. So I will stand by my speculation that had this offensive succeeded, and as I hope I belabored for an hour and 10 minutes or whatever, that it probably should have succeeded, it really would have changed the Civil War. It really would have changed the war.
As you alluded to and clearly identified, I look at the strategic failure, just staying with the federal side. Why or do you blame Meade or Grant for the failure to communicate with a clear objective of the troops?
Good question, and if you read anybody's read my book, You can see, and I was pretty hard on Grant, and I'm surprised because I like Grant. I admire Grant. I think Grant was, one of the leading soldiers of the war, and still do. But these 6 weeks, not only from June 13th when he's getting ready to cross the James, all the Battle of the Crater on July 30th, these are not. This is not Grant's finest hour. Grant is surprisingly disengaged, I think, from the operation. As I mentioned, at some point, Meade is the one creating all of the tactical plans for the assaults. Grant has almost nothing to do with it. He seems remarkably detached from the failures. He only goes forward once to the front lines during this entire time, despite being 8 miles, a 45-minute or a 40-minute horseback ride from his headquarters at City Point. He only ventured out of City Point once during this entire 4 days to see what was going on at the front, delegating responsibility to Meade and Butler for everything that went on. He certainly was the only man who should have and could have informed those 5 fellows, Meade, Butler, Smith, and Hancock, about what was going on the plans for June 15th. He didn't do it. Those guys did not know what was happening. They didn't know each other, what was supposed to happen. That's Grant's job. So I like Grant. There's a cottage industry, as some of you no doubt have read some of these. There's 3 or 4 real anti-Grant books out there that have been published in the last 7, 8 years. And so there's this growing sort of movement to be real critical of Grant. Well, I'm not, don't put me in that category. But at this stage of the war, he's not doing too well in these 6 weeks. So I think Meade does everything he can do. I think Meade is blameless for this. He's giving orders. He's got a machine, and he's mashing the button to make the machine go forward, and the machine's going. It's just not working. And you can't hold that against Meade.
Any others?
All right. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate being here.
Just one more second.
Okay.
Will, got one more thing for you. The Certificate of Honor by order of the General Staff of the Civil War Roundtable of Milwaukee. This award is presented to A. Wilson Greene for furthering our understanding of the causes and consequences of the American Civil War, the watershed event in our nation's history.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Really appreciate it. And thank you all for being interested in our American history. It is more important now than it's ever been in our lifetimes to be cognizant of and spread the story of American history. And by your presence here, I know you are all believers in that, and I thank you for that.